pretty easily on another, that there's a kind of one-to-one ratio between this word in English and this word in Japan. And that's not the case at all. There are some words that have pretty straightforward translations, but they are few and far between, especially in Japanese and English. But it goes beyond that. It also you have to talk about the differences in what makes a good, satisfying piece of dramatic dialogue to a native English speaker versus someone who grew up speaking Japanese. Language plays a very different role in the story if it's told by a Japanese speaker versus a story told in English. English, by some weird fluke of its development, because English, perhaps more than any other language, has borrowed and stolen and chased other languages down blind alleys, beaten them and stolen, as somebody made that phrase once, and so English is a beautiful, weird, rolling snowball bastard of a language that just has so much, and it's totally, anyone that gets, people like grammar Nazis, I love grammar Nazis because they're idiots, because every time I'm like, that's not how it should be said, I'm like, oh really, you don't think English evolves? We just decided to fucking stop letting the language evolve after Jane Austen wrote, fuck you. There's plenty of, well, it's not logical. English is not a logical language by any means. In fact, exploring the illogical nature of English is delightfully fun for writers, because you're like, how does that make sense? It does, I have no idea how. Japanese is very different, and again, my partner, Brandon, is deeply fluent. He is at N2 certification, which is one cert away from being native level speaking, and so he's pretty damn well off. He can get off the plane and go anywhere in Japan and speak with just about anybody. And it's a hard language to use because it's very high context, what linguists call high context. Now, English itself can be very high context as well, but there's a little more range. It's not always high context. Japanese is almost always high context. It's either very high context, and I'll explain what that is in a moment, or it's extremely obvious. You guys will notice when you're watching a subtitle version or you're watching the Japanese that sometimes the characters tend to just kind of announce how they feel, or they kind of wear their hearts on their sleeve, or they kind of remark on the obvious, something that English speakers don't do. This isn't a judgment on how they tell stories, like that it's better or worse, it's just a fact. English, by dint of being this weird snowballing bastard of a language that it is, has developed aesthetically into a language where even day-to-day speech, we almost never say exactly what we mean, or mean exactly what we say. There is this understood tension between what we mean versus what we actually feel we can get out. For example, if I'm in line at a Starbucks, and I've been there for a while, and someone cuts in front of me last minute, and I feel slighted, I'm pissed off, I will probably say something along the lines of, excuse me, I believe I was next? That's not what I mean. What I mean is probably closer to, bitch! But I won't say that, and if I were the type of person to say it, that's a kind of special character that has a role to play in the dynamic of a drama that's like, oh, the character that just says whatever comes to mind, but they tend to be special cases and not as interesting as protagonists, because they don't have the same struggle with their speech that most characters do. Attack on Titan, I can talk about for ages about. Attack on Titan is a sustained meditation on what you can and can't say when you are focused, hyper-focused on survival. It's a beautiful, beautiful exploration of that idea. The whole thing starts with his mother, basically as she's about to be killed, telling them, go the fuck away, I want to save your life, and you don't need to be here. If you try to save me, you'll die too. Go, leave, leave, leave. But she cannot stop herself from saying, please don't leave me. All she can do is roll her hand over her mouth. That's that right there, and that image alone is that little chestnut of the whole show's theme. It's about Titans and politics and humanity struggling to make sense of itself when it's constantly under attack, both internally and externally. But it's essentially, for me at least, as one of the writers on the show for years, it's a show about how we are forced to kind of curtail our expression when you have to be concerned with living another day. It's like trying to say I love you for the first time to someone, and you have to want to finesse it, you want it to be just perfect. You can't just scream it out of a moving car when the object of your affection is standing on a curb. It doesn't fucking work like that. And it's not gonna have the same effect, right? Everything needs to be just perfect, and if you never have that perfect moment, what do you say? So Brandon, there's a great example of the difference between how a piece of dialogue functions in a Japanese show, be it anime or live action, and how it functions in English.
Never mind.
In an English show, be it stage, whatever. So let's imagine for a moment that we're sitting in this room and God forbid an earthquake hits. It's a is a real life example, by the way. Brandon, this comes to me from Brandon, who worked in downtown Tokyo in an office for years where earthquakes were not infrequent. And if we imagine we're sitting here, and this is like a dramatic scene, you know, the audience is going to be engaged, and we're all sitting here, and an earthquake hits. You know, quickly, just give me a few seconds of the kind of things that would be coming out of your mouth. Right, okay, so I'm hearing a lot of different things. Some people say, fuck, we're all gonna die, run, oh my god, things like that, right? What we're not saying is what actually happens in Japan. Brandon said, you're telling me every time this happens, oh my god, I'm so embarrassed for you. I'm kidding. My phone's not even off either. The building, the office would start shaking. And of course, people would freak out and they would begin vocalizing, as you do when you're freaking out in that situation. But instead of saying the kind of things we English speakers would say, they would just about all of them, say the same fucking thing. Yuritudu, and repeat it over and over again, like little prairie dogs coming up. Which is, you know, interesting. Now, of course, in their mind, it's perfectly appropriate for their situation. That's how they would use language. Yuritudu literally translate as, it's shaking. Now, if I were writing an anime and there's a scene where an earthquake hits and everyone starts vocalizing in that moment to give the moment a little reality, it would be perfectly appropriate to have everyone on screen say yuritudu, because that is what the Japanese ear would have known people say. That's what they're used to hearing. If in that same dramatic, thrilling moment I adapted it literally, and had all the English actors saying, it's shaking, it's shaking, it's shaking, it's shaking. We would never hear that except in a comedy. And so now I've created an unintentionally hilarious moment where the audience should really be concerned for your lives, and instead they're thinking it's fucking weird that you're all just saying it's shaking. But Japanese, it's all more than that. Japanese, there are ways that you can conjugate verbs, which is a fucking thing. There's a way to conjugate verbs depending on the status of the person you are addressing. So you conjugate your verbs differently if you're talking to someone older versus if you're talking to someone younger. It's called kegel, and it's a bizarre concept. And I think it's extremely important. Getting to the high context concept.